Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. We carry out our work on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We're pleased to share this conversation centered around Chinatown, its past, present, and future, that was presented at our 2023 festival in partnership with the Chinatown Storytelling Centre. Kevin Chong, author of the Giller Prize shortlisted novel The Double Life of Benson Yu, moderated this event with Christina, Wong, and Daniel Innes, the author and illustrator of the Canada Reads finalist Denison Avenue. Henry Tsang, author of White Riot, the 1907 anti-Asian riots in Vancouver, which won the City of Vancouver Book Award. And Fae Myenne Ng, author of the memoir Orphan Bachelors, which won the California Book Award for Nonfiction. This event was recorded on October 21st, 2023. The Vancouver Writers Fest would like to thank our public sector funders without whom we couldn't do our work: the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island.
We all know a Chinatown, at least we think we do. These neighborhoods, usually over a century old, usually somewhere in a city's downtown area, are the traditional homes of the Asian diaspora. These ethnic enclaves were formed at the turn of the 20th century as the gold rush and later railroad construction brought over droves of Chinese from Guangdong province until racist restrictions stopped further migration across the Pacific. It's in Chinatowns, which often held space for other non-white minorities, where the Chinese diaspora weathered homesickness, scapegoating as sources of disease and low wages, racist riots, rallied to support democracy back in their homeland, and found work and housing from various tongs or fraternal organizations. Buffeted by anti-Asian violence and COVID-19 restrictions, Chinatowns are seeing diminished retail activity and fewer visits from tourists. Chinatown supporters are now wondering whether there is a future. Now I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to ask the first question to Daniel and Christina. Denison Avenue was recently, this week, longlisted for the Carnegie Medal in Fiction. It's a prestigious honor. So my first question is, what does Chinatown and the history of Chinese exclusion mean to you? And in what ways were current events, namely anti-Asian violence, an impetus to write your book?
So for Chinatown, it has always been representative home and belonging for me. It was where family and I would go every week to go for dim sum and do grocery shopping and stuff like that. And it was represented home. And I didn't actually know about the Exclusion Act until maybe in high school, where my English teacher just recommended some books for me to read for our independent study unit. And that's where I learned about the Exclusion Act, and not actually from school history. And from there, that was always top of mind for me. But it didn't necessarily have an impact on the book writing. I do mention it in one chapter, but it didn't have, it wasn't the driving force behind the book.
Daniel?
Like Christina, I didn't even know about it until later on, until more recently, even living in that neighborhood for so long. The drive to make the book was really for both of us, just to make this sort of time capsule thing that we could, just to have, just because we really love the neighborhood so much, and it was shifting from what it was. So we really wanted to save something, just for us.
I like the idea of it as being a time capsule. It seems to, it's already sort of, time is moving forward in Chinatown and that area in Toronto is really changing. Henry, can you speak to what Chinatown, the history of Chinese exclusion means to you?
I actually wrote some notes, but I'm going to ignore them. Well, it's so complicated. I mean, the whole reason why there was a Chinatown in the first place is because the Chinese weren't allowed to live anywhere else. So yeah, that's the history of exclusion. So the folks who had to live there, they built their own community and they struggled, and there's incredible poverty, and where they came from was a mess. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be here. They ended up in a different kind of mess. That it was home, yeah. And people, they make do, right? And they survive, they struggle. They find joy in whatever ways they can. They drown their sorrows through distractions, whether that's alcohol, opium, gambling, etc. And there's the good stuff and there's the bad stuff. There's a lot of bad stuff. The Chinese weren't the only ones who suffered around here, right? It was a resource extraction industry area, and it was mostly males, but there were way more males for the Chinese because of the head tax and then Exclusion Act and so forth. So with that kind of history, what is Chinatown, I guess, today, when you have the freedom to live where you want to? That's great, right? So Chinatown was a place where when I told my parents I was moving out, and I told them I was going to move to Strathcona, which is the neighborhood that's connected to Chinatown, right next to Chinatown, they were really upset because, and this is not uncommon, they said, why would you move into a place where people are trying so hard to move out of? It's kind of like it's backwards. Because it was a ghetto. It was a place where folks who didn't speak English, who didn't have a strong command of English, they were stuck there because that's where they could get a job and not outside. So yeah, it's a very complicated history. I'm not saying that it's not important at all. It's really important that we have to recognize and understand where we've come from and where we need to still keep working towards more equality, more rights for everybody, and to recognize that we don't keep doing this to other people if we have any power to do so.
Thanks so much, Henry. Faye, can you speak about how what Chinatown means to you and how the history of Chinese exclusion has affected you? I know this is basically the subject of your book, but for the audience.
To just continue the commentary, I did grow up in Chinatown. It was in the 60s. It was a glitzy ghetto. We lived there, we worked there, we played there, and the tourists came in to observe us. What can I say about its existence or my knowledge of exclusion? Its existence was a visual daily reminder of exclusion. It was in the early 60s, my sister and I were very young girls, and there were not many children. And so it was very apparent to us that the group of old men in the park came from something tragic. My father insisted that we adopt them by calling each one grandfather. And they essentially, we had a grocery store there for a while, and they would just come in and sit, and we would serve them tea, and they would tell stories. They would also, when they knew they were dying, they would bring their possessions, a watch, which they said, give to your brother, not the girls, give to your brother when he goes to college. They would give us little lifesaver candies. It was a treat. They were gentle and kind and generous in their way, but they were tragic. My father named them orphan bachelors because they were tragic, but they were romantic. And here's the best kind of story about their existence and their trouble and their urgency to have life continue. This Sunday in the World Journal, my colleague, Professor Xiaoling Wong, wrote a beautiful essay, and it begins with her going to Chinatown in the 80s with her young child, who she treated to one of those wooden rocking chair carousel pony rides. And little Hua Hua was so happy. And she said, Ling mentioned she had sanhe, which is like she was in heaven. She was, had the breath of God because she was so happy. Her eyes were glowing and she was just radiant with joy. And Ling then noticed an old man next to her or beside her, and he was staring at her child, staring at her with this dropped jaw. I'm exaggerating. I can't read Chinese very well anymore, but I read this first paragraph, and she used this term to describe the man, and it translates hungry ghost. And I had not thought of that, but it is so true. These men who could not have descendants because the Chinese exclusion law in 1876, women were excluded. In 1882, men were excluded. There was an anti-miscegenation law until 1943, 1948 in California, 1976 in Virginia, which meant men couldn't marry outside of their race. So there was no hope to have a descendant. So this old man was staring at Ling's daughter with this hunger. I am not going to have a descendant who will come to my grave and feed my spirit. This is the consequence of exclusion. So I always knew about it, and I could not write this book.
Thank you so much, Faye. Reading your book, comparing it to the history of anti-Chinese racism in Canada, you see it's so much the same, but they used to have different sort of names of the laws. And at some point, I know in Vancouver, I think the men outnumbered the women 50-1. And there was during the Depression era, there was actually a law that prevented white women from working in Chinese-owned restaurants because they feared that there was going to be this corruption of white women. I want to ask you the next question, Faye. Can we talk about the challenges of researching your book? What was the most difficult part, and were there any parts that were especially rewarding?
Since this history was in my bones, I knew the consequence of this history. So when I had to lay down the story, the history on paper, it was very, very difficult because so much more came out. It was so pervasive, it was so determined. Essentially, with the Exclusion Act, with the disruption of female-male balance, there were 4 generations from 1982 to 1943 in America. That's 61 years, that's 4 generations that were unborn. And I have said this again and again, my father's great line: exclusion is a brilliant and bloodless piece of legislation because you didn't have to kill any Chinese. You just made sure none were born. So the research was painful to understand what my father and his generation went through. And the research taught me that it doesn't stop there. You have this kind of sexual imbalance. It doesn't end. It doesn't end in 1966 when immigration opened up. It does not end. It is going to be with many, many more generations. That was difficult to understand how deep and deliberate this legislation is still alive.
Faye. Henry, I'm going to turn to you to ask that question about researches, challenges, rewards.
I was going to build a little bit off of what you're talking about. I didn't know a lot of this history around the 1907 Fantasia riots. Like I mentioned before, I didn't learn about it till later in life, relatively speaking. And I knew about the Komagatamaru incident, 1914, and I didn't actually know about the first anti-Chinese riot in Vancouver, which happened just a few months after the incorporation of the city. Although during the election, there was also a race riot when the manager of the Hastings Mill brought his workers over to vote for him as mayor. And then the white people around the polling station attacked the indigenous and Chinese workers and drove them away. So that, I don't know if it's a riot, an attack anyways. But so the 1887 anti-Chinese riot was in the Cole Harbor area. So doing this research, it's kind of horrifying to discover that, for instance, since British Columbia joined Confederation, that one of the very first acts that was passed in Victoria was to take away the vote of Indigenous and Chinese people. Because prior to that, there was no rule for or against, because there was no such thing as Canada that British Columbia was part of at the time. And then 88 attempts, most of which were successful, attempts to pass laws restricting the Chinese from other rights or the ability to work in certain industries. Oftentimes Indigenous were lumped in there too with the Chinese. And then when the Japanese started coming over a decade or two later, more and more Japanese were targeted, and also South Asians were then targeted. It was trickier for the South Asians because they were British subjects, as the, like Canada being part of the British Empire and so forth. So it raises the question for anyone who takes their rights for granted. How many rights do you actually have, being who you are? Maybe you don't actually have as many rights as somebody else. You need to do that kind of research to figure out, well, there's this kind of so-called progress, but who's still being excluded? And yeah, so that for me was eye-opening, because I grew up here and I just didn't know that it was really very recent in my lifetime anyways, that I got to benefit from the struggles that previous generations had to fight to give me and my family and folks around us.
Thanks, Henry. Christina and Dana, your work is a work of fiction, and it has a graphic element in it. But was there a lot of research involved, and was it difficult? Was it rewarding?
Yeah, I'll go first. So my half, the books are split into two halves, and mine is like before and after illustrations for each page. That kind of invites you to take the walk that the main character does in the novel. You can follow along with her. So for me, it kind of almost referred to my half of the book as like a funeral slideshow. Like these are all places that were just really important to both of us. And I just kind of really needed some closure too, because sorry, I'm really jet lagged, so I get emotional. But so the research part was nice. I got to kind of revisit these places, and just the illustration part is just labor. So it really kind of helped me work through each space and then move on to the next one. And then, yeah, I don't look at the book anymore, but I'm happy I went through the process. Yeah.
For me, like, our book is very rooted in grief and loss. And I guess it was really hard for me to always be in that headspace to write and be always sad. But it was just our way of, I guess, explaining the loss of not just of a person, but of a language, of a community, of a neighborhood, of things you're familiar with, and how a person can navigate that, and how we navigate that, and how everyone navigates loss in their own lives. Some more detailed elements or a more personal level I put in the book were things I found in my dad's things or my grandparents or great-grandparents' things. And I guess it was very emotional for me to find these things and put it in the book because I deeply regret that I can't ask them what those things are or why they kept them. So I can only imagine what they were, and I guess it was my way of memorializing or honoring their heritage. I guess a positive thing was I love looking at Daniel's illustrations, and my Toy-san improved writing.
Thanks so much, you two. I'm going to move to Henry for the next question. I think in your remarks, you talked about how, like, what does Chinatown mean now that you can live anywhere? And you also talked about how your parents reacted to you moving to Strathcona. Nowadays, I think the diasporic Chinese communities in North America live in these ethnoburbs, be they Richmond in BC, Markham in Toronto. My question is, what is lost when a Chinatown stops becoming a living community? It continues only as a tourist trap.
Yeah. Before I address your question, I just want to say I forgot to add one little detail to my little diatribe from earlier on about the legislations that BC passed or attempted to pass. And the 88 attempts were all before 1900. Like in the space of like 27 years, they attempted 88 laws to restrict Chinese specifically, and also bundling in there other people too. Okay, so in response to your question about tourism's role in the economy of a city and Chinatown's place within it. Is that the question? I'm trying to turn this into a paper.
What's lost when it just becomes just a tourist trap and no longer a living community? And because, we have these ethnoburbs that are like thriving Chinese communities and Chinatowns in their own way.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to bring up 3 cities that I've been to recently. San Francisco being one, Toronto being another, and Yokohama being the third, comparing to Vancouver. So I'm going to start backwards. Yokohama is really a touristy kind of kitschy space. I don't know if ever you've been to the Yokohama Chinatown, but it's part of Japan, and Japan's got this kind of exuberant otaku and like the signage with that almost like falls onto the street on top of you, and the bright garish colors and all that stuff. It just felt so surface for me as someone who's Chinese. I didn't like, my grandparents actually lived in Yokohama for a few years. And so for me, it was really like interesting to move through that space and just not feel like connected to it whatsoever. Also, it's mainland Chinese dominant. So it doesn't have any of the Cantonese diasporic flavor of North American Chinatowns that San Francisco and Toronto and Vancouver have, where they were built as a reflection of the villages where these folks came from southeastern China. Because those Chinatowns are called Tongyangai, which in Cantonese is Tang Dynasty People's Street, as opposed to, literally Chinatown. No one calls it Chinatown in Chinese. So San Francisco's is declining. Toronto's is also declining. But Vancouver, in the race to decline, is way ahead. Like way, way ahead. How many shuttered buildings do we have? How hard is it to attract Chinese people to live in that area? No problems attracting folks who are not Chinese to live in those condos that are going up, and there's current resistance to the 105 Kiefer BD development ongoing, but they got the green light, so we're going to see what happens. So there are so many pressures around Chinatowns because they were all ghettoized right next to a small growing town at the time. And those growing towns have now become cities, and now they're kind of prime real estate. And what happens when people have left those areas? Is tourism the answer to keep it alive when you don't actually have Chinese people living there anymore? We have half a generation left of seniors in Chinatown here who we need to support them, right? I mean, they got nowhere else to go, and they're really poor. So what can we do to maintain places where they can go get food for cheap, because they can't afford the places where they sell $20 cocktails or $6 coffees, for that matter. So yeah, it's a challenge. You know, what other options are there besides maybe, as Andy Yan, who's a contributor in the book, is suggesting amongst other folks, why don't we build housing that attracts the people who would make Chinatown alive again? Those kinds of people. Well, maybe that would be discriminatory. Maybe, I don't know. But we also target certain populations to have a certain kind of housing, access to housing. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not suggesting this part specifically, but it's an interesting question. You need people to be in a place to have communities. Buildings are not a community.
So much, Henry. I'm going to turn this over to Daniel and Christina. What does it mean, nowadays when Chinatown is sort of dying? What is lost when it becomes just a tourist trap, or when you have these ethnoburbs where there are thriving Chinese communities?
Well, the original Chinatown in Toronto already was demolished, and that was for the City Hall building. And there's maybe a small strip of restaurants after, and then two other ones were built. So the Chinatown in our neighborhood, yeah, is definitely shifting very quickly. Most things are just getting torn down and turning into condos. So it's not, the original population's gone. Most of the original restaurants are, almost all of them are completely gone now too. So you have less and less of that community feeling constantly, like every year. But it's always been shifting too, because that Chinatown kind of started later after the first one was demolished. So it was always changing, but now it's definitely just corporate feeling. You don't have that, you can't afford to live there anymore. You don't have, it's shifted so much, and now it's just shifting to office space. So it's
And I feel like the Chinatown that we grew up with, or 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we're never going to get that back. And it's a way of, how do we reconcile somehow keeping some tradition, but also moving forward, but not erasing everyone's narratives that were there or are still there. And it's, I guess one way, housing would be a good, what Henry had mentioned. Or in Toronto, they just started a Chinatown Land Trust, and it's to enable the working class residents to still live there while they're being pushed out. So if that could be an option of keeping that Chinatown intact. But it's still a long way to go, but hopefully we can make it more of an inclusive neighborhood.
Thank you, Christina. Faye, can you speak to the question about, what is lost when we no longer have an active Chinatown?
Okay, I will speak to it in terms of how I live as a writer. I grew up in Chinatown. My father created a very sweet office, my first writing sanctuary, in a one-bedroom apartment that housed 6 of us and 4 chickens. My father knew I needed space because I was the oldest, and I took care of all my siblings and all the kids in the apartment complex. And I translated for everyone. I was really busy as a child. And so he created an office by drilling a hole in the door frame and giving me a metal rod to stick in the door frame. That was my lock. And when I went in there, I had privacy. And that began my need for privacy and my writing career, because in that office, I would read the newspapers that the orphan bachelor upstairs would throw at my door when he got off his janitor shift at the Fairmont Hotel. So this is a community effort to raise children, to educate children. And what it gave me as a writer was I can either write in really tight, small spaces. I lived for decades in Manhattan in a postage stamp, 300-foot studio. And I loved it in Manhattan because nobody knew you. It was so crowded, you could be anonymous. You could just go anywhere, nobody noticed you, nobody cared what you did. And in San Francisco, in Chinatown, I can still feel the same way. And I take that kind of ability to work in small spaces and to create privacy with me everywhere. I can either live in tight cities or I can live out in the desert where there is no one, which is actually really good because no one bothers you because there's no one but the coyotes. So that's what Chinatown taught me about writing and privacy and the need for space. Privacy I'm talking about is when you live with so many people, you know everyone's business, you're in everyone's business. There were orphan bachelors who committed suicide on our floor, and my father would have to clean out their apartments. So life was complete. Children were not shielded. No, you know, you got it all. That's how life should offer, all for everyone.
Lovely answer. I'm afraid that means our time is up, actually. I'm sad because I saw other hands raised, and this has been a very sort of lovely, attentive audience. Once again, I want to thank our wonderful speakers, Daniel Innes, Christina Wong, Henry Tsang, and Fae Myenne Ng. Thank you.
You have been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. To hear more events like this one and view our upcoming events, visit our website at writersfest.bc.ca.